I'd like to welcome everyone to the premiere of Feed and Grain Bites, our new podcast that will cover topics important to the feed and grain industry. I'm Lisa Cleaver with Feed and Grain Magazine, and today we have Christy Swoboda, Technical Services Director with Romer Labs, with us to discuss Harvest 2020 and mycotoxin trends that she's seeing. So welcome, Christy.
Hello.
I'm just going to dive right in with our first question. At this time of year, what type of commodities do you typically see submitted to the lab for mycotoxin analysis?
Sure. So as we move into harvest season, harvest completion, even across the U.S., at first we start to see a lot of raw grains come into our lab. So we see corn, wheat, rice, soybeans, so on. It helps to get indications of what to expect. As the season, or harvest season moves on, we start to keep trends of what type of contamination levels that were repeatedly being detected. That helps us start to regionalize those mycotoxin concerns as a year-to-year kind of mycotoxin issue arises on that geographical regional basis. As we know, mycotoxins don't impact the entire crop across the whole U.S., so really understanding where the best grain to say is coming from and where there might be mycotoxin issues is good for us to know. As the season does progress, we see a change in those samples as they move into more complex feed ingredients or even final products. So we start to see a lot of, say, silage samples, TMRs, which are those total mixed rations, corn gluten feed, corn gluten pellets, feed samples themselves. We start seeing complex finished products coming in as that new crop starts to be put into feed production.
Great. Can you explain a little bit how mycotoxin testing is conducted in the grain industry?
Sure. So when I first started in the mycotoxin testing industry, which is about 18 years ago now, our analytical lab primarily focused on testing those raw grains again. So we really did most of our work specifically in corn, in wheat, and then in soybean and rice again. Over the years, especially the past 5, maybe going back as far as 10 years, the mycotoxin testing industry is shifting from really using reference testing, which is something like an analytical lab does, to using a rapid test kit, such as those lateral flow testing devices, in order to test the raw grain. So a lot of the raw grain testing is moving away from something like our analytical lab and more into diagnostic test kits. And as a result of that, our labs focus a lot more on the complex side of feed ingredients and feed products. Some of the reasons I think this is occurring is, one, the diagnostic test kits over the last several years have greatly improved, both in their reliability and accuracy in detecting mycotoxins. Many of them are now validated against lab reference methods, and they even seek external validation, such as something from GIPSA or AOAC. If those tools have become better, customers are bringing the testing of those raw grains onto their site at their facility, be it a grain elevator, or a grain terminal, ethanol facility, ingredient manufacturer, the feed manufacturer, to even a pet food manufacturer. All of those doing that testing on site has meant that they have an immediate decision as far as accepting the grain, rejecting the grain, or really diverting it into a different product based upon what the mycotoxin contamination level shows. As that transition keeps occurring, as I said, we're getting more of those complex feed ingredients or food products into testing, where again, 15, 18 years ago, we predominantly tested the raw grains, and then testing to some extent stopped with mycotoxins. We didn't really follow it upstream. So as the industry continues to evolve and our understanding of mycotoxins continues to deepen and how they're produced, we now know in further levels that mycotoxins can grow post-harvest due to improper storage, and that even if those mycotoxins continue to grow, we also know that we can see now synergistic effects of many mycotoxins, say below regulatory limits, that cause issues in our animal species as well. It's kind of a multitude of diagnostic test kits getting a lot better for quick decisions, plus increased education and understanding of mycotoxin growth patterns and effects on the animal species that's continuing to drive kind of higher testing needs across the industry.
Very interesting. Where does the harvest of the 2020 crop stand right now?
What we've been told, most of this is going on at external contacts of ours, is that beginning of November, the crop was about 75 or 70% harvested across the U.S. Typically, this time of year, we're in the 50 to 60% harvested range nationally. So we're hearing that we are ahead of schedule, which is good. And also indications are pointing that at least 2/3 of the corn crop specifically, we've heard is in good condition, at least from the mycotoxin standpoint. Yeah, that's the only part that I can really speak on today.
So if we're looking at the 2020 crop so far, which mycotoxins are you analyzing for?
Sure. So in the U.S., really on a year-over-year basis, we focus most attention on 6 mycotoxins, or really 6 mycotoxin groups. Those are aflatoxins, humanisins, ochratoxin A, Zoralanone, and then a group of trichothecanes, which is where we get T2 toxin and Dan from. It's very common practice within the industry for manufacturers to find diagnostic test kits for those 6 mycotoxins readily available. Those are also the 6 that are most often regulated, not only in the U.S., but also Canada and internationally. So year over year, that's where we spend most of our time in testing and in discussions. Of those 6, we do focus most on aflatoxin. Then we see a lot of interest in humanisin and Dan levels. And then we're even seeing some interesting trends in Zoralanone that we want to discuss a little bit later as well.
Okay, so you say that most attention is spent on observations of aflatoxin contamination. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. So aflatoxin's the most toxic naturally occurring carcinogen that we know of. So it leads to lots of both research and consensus regarding the toxicity of it. So aflatoxin production occurs as a result of Aspergillus mold contamination within the grain. So year to year, dependent upon environmental conditions, growth of that toxin can be quite prevalent in different regions. The Aspergillus molds that produce aflatoxin B1, which is the most toxic of them, is also favorable when conditions can be wet or high humidity post-harvest. So we spend a lot of time looking at grains, how they've been stored, after that harvest period. And then the Aspergillus molds are also active in products with high fat content. So if depending upon where that grain is going into a feed system, we spend a lot of time also testing those ingredients or the finished product just to keep an eye, since we know it can continue to grow, that we keep an eye on the fat content and getting those moisture levels down. From a U.S. regulatory perspective, 20 ppb of aflatoxin is the critical threshold. That's the regulatory limit for both humans and dairy animals within the U.S. So it's imperative, to really have good diagnostic testing, good sampling year over year to know that we're below that 20 ppb threshold. We look at data that we've had internally over the past few months. Around 0.5% of our samples have tested above 20 ppb, which is really good. That's a very small percentage. And then if we look at this time of year in 2020 compared back to the last few years, we're actually seeing about 3 times as many samples. So our sample volume has increased, but we're not seeing that percentage increase. So we stay around that 0.5% greater than 20 ppb, which is very good. Furthermore than that, this year we're also seeing that at least 90% of what we test below 4 ppb. So it's reaching below some of the limit of detection of some kits, which is good news as well.
And what are you seeing in regards to humanisin and Dan?
Right. So luckily, we don't hear a lot of chatter about either one of those toxins this year, which is good news. We're not hearing feedback from our test kit customers, nor are we seeing a large increase in sample submissions for either of those 2 toxins. To date, what we've analyzed in the 2020 crop appears to be similar, maybe a little better than what they were last year. So humanisin, we're concerned with levels around 5,000 parts per billion. We're concerned at this level as adverse impacts can occur on horses, rabbits, and swine. Horses are particularly susceptible the higher the concentration of humanicin goes, as it often causes softening of the white matter of their brains and even liver necrosis. So in 2019, last year's crop, it was common for us to find on average 3,400 ppb of humanicin, which was kind of indicative of the years before. It seemed to be pretty steady. So in 2020, so far we're seeing levels closer to 1,300. So it is lower, which is a good sign. Still too early for us to say if that's conclusive of the crop overall this year, or if just the regions that we've been testing have seen those decreases. When it comes to DON, again, swine are the animals that we often talk about. Noticeably, DON is also referred to as vomitoxin for obvious reasons. As swine consume feed that's contaminated with DON, vomiting would ensue, which is where it received that name. If we look at other partners around the world, Europe regulates DON at 1,250 ppb in unprocessed cereal grains. So if we use that kind of as our guideline, last year we were seeing results around 900 ppb, where this year we're at about 775. So very similar, potentially a slight decrease, but a little too soon to know for sure what the end of year results will look like.
Earlier, you mentioned some interesting trends in Zoralanone. Could you discuss what you're seeing in more detail?
The last few years for us, Zoralanone has received a lot of attention, at least by our teams and some of our clients and partners. A lot of people don't discuss Zoralanone in detail, mostly because there is an absence of regulation for it. What we often say, though, is that just because it isn't regulated doesn't mean it's not dangerous. So we still need to be mindful of what's going on. When we talk Zoralanone, again, we talk swine, not that they're the only ones, but they seem to be very susceptible to it, and it causes some hypoestrogenism issues. Analytically, what we're seeing is that the trend continues to increase. So we've seen a steady rise over the past 3 years. So if we look at data of ours from the 2018 crop, we averaged around 600 ppb Zoralanone. So if you compare that to 2019, we were seeing results around 830 ppb. But if you look at 2020 so far, we're now up over 1,100 ppb. So as our average continues to increase, we need to be mindful of it, because if it's increasing in the raw grains, it's also then increasing in our feed ingredients, which in turn can be increasing, in animal feed or even pet food. Not only is our average increasing, but what we saw was that in 2018, 6 out of 10 samples tested higher than 500, but only 1 in 10 tested higher than 1,000. So if we go a year later, we were at 9 out of 10 were above 500, but we moved from 1 in 10 to now 2 out of 10 that are higher than 1,000. And if we look at where we are so far this year, we're now seeing even 4 out of 10 are higher than that 1,000. So we're seeing that year over year that Zoralanone level does continue to increase in the severity of that higher end of detection.
Overall, how would you compare this year to last year? Are you seeing similar or shifting trends in mycotoxin results?
Right. So overall, Aflatoxin, Humanicin, DON. We didn't talk today about Aflatoxin or T2 toxin that I mentioned. For Afladon, Humanicin, those levels detected in the 2020 crop, none of them have been above the regulatory limit, which of course is step number one. Beyond that, we're not seeing any increases above the levels that we saw last year. When we look at Aflatoxin and T2, those toxins are less relevant, less prevalent, I should say, in the U.S. crop. So that's more, if they do occur, usually when they occur, it's more of an anomaly than the norm. So we're not seeing signs of them this year. As I mentioned with Zoralanone, we're seeing that increase in some of the feed ingredients. But as we continue to move conclusively out of the 2019 crop with feed ingredients and into the 2020 crop conclusively, we'll know for sure if that trend of the last 3 years is going to continue, or if we're going to see some stability brought to that toxin as well. Kind of in closing, it's good news. There's not a crisis situation out there. There's not a toxin that we're overly concerned with. what we see is, for the most part, common. Doesn't mean it doesn't impact animals. Doesn't mean that there's not some clinical issues occurring in livestock. Those still occur. Those can still occur even when low levels of mycotoxins are there, especially as we get into some synergistic effect things. But overall, it does look like the crop looks pretty good, which is ultimately good news for all of us.
Absolutely. Well, that's all I have for you today, Christy. I'd like to thank you for joining us and discussing mycotoxins, and I'd like to thank all of you for listening. For more information, click the link in the description below. Thanks.